Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us here on CPA Academy. This is Jason Bookman speaking. I am not currently on camera, but you should be able to see both of our presenters for today's webinar on diversity and inclusion one-on-one Affinity Groups. Today's webinar will be presented by Jina Etienne and by Guylaine Saint Juste. And before we get into the webinar, I want to go through a couple of quick technical checks and make sure that everything's working for all of you in the audience. So first, if you haven't done so already, head over to the questions panel. Let me know that you can hear my voice, see the slides, and see our presenters on screen. Feel free to let us know where you're listening in from. We always love knowing where the audience is, where all of you are. And so far, I see a few people checking in from Santa Barbara and Tampa and from Ohio. Thank you for letting me know that everything's working. And of course, if anyone is having trouble listening or accessing the technology throughout the webinar, go ahead and let me know in the questions panel. I'll do everything I can to make sure that everything is working for all of you as quickly as possible. And of course, that questions panel is also there for your questions. So if you have any questions for our presenters throughout the webinar, go ahead and put those questions right here in the questions panel. On to some quick housekeeping regarding polls and credit for today's webinar. This is a 1 CPE webinar, and in order to earn that CPE, you need to stay logged in for at least 50 minutes and answer at least 3 of the 4 polling questions that we'll have offered throughout the webinar. Polls will be announced, and when they come up, just hit the button corresponding with your answer and then hit the submit button to confirm your response. Our team here at CPA Academy will make sure that you have your credit by the end of the day today, and that will be available in your CPA Academy accounts, along with access to all of the associated webinar materials, including a video archive and access to the webinar handouts. And those handouts are available over in the GoToWebinar Handouts section right now, in case you want to go ahead and access those inside the webinar. And those handouts are, of course, available to download in your CPA Academy accounts. So now we've gotten to the end of the housekeeping. Everything is ready to go. So Jina, I'll turn it over to you. Let's get started, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you everyone for joining again. Welcome back. This is D&I One-on-One. Today we're talking about affinity groups, and today I am joined by Guylaine Saint Juste. I think I got that right. Guylaine is the president and CEO of NABA. Prior to joining NABA, she served 2 different roles at Europe, first as executive director of the National Capital Region. She then moved on to becoming managing director at a newly formed strategy called Employer of Influence. Before that, she spent over 3 decades in the financial services industry. Now, Guylaine is an author, a speaker, and an activist at heart. She's also a self-described disruptor, which I want to hear more about. Welcome, Guylaine. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be with you today.
Jina, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation with you, and welcome to everyone. Pleased to be here.
So just want to remind everybody to put your questions in as we go along, because I will be watching the question queue and be posing them to you, Guylaine, as we go. But you said you're a self-described disruptor, and we're talking about affinity groups, and you have a really unique perspective on them. So can you tell me more? When we first started talking, you know, when I said, hey, would you like to join me? And what do you want to talk about? And this subject is really important to you. Can you tell us more about that?
So a disruptor for me, as you can imagine, as a Black woman with a name that no one can say, who has none of the pedigree used in financial services, which is an industry, as you know, that is widely dominated by right-brainers, and I'm definitely a left-brainer. And I call myself a disruptor because I think there are lots of ways people think it's the only way to do things. It's the structured way to do things. And I think what I have had the privilege of doing throughout my career is to prove that right-brainers do good work, and so can left-brainers too, and that there are other ways to think, other ways to imagine, you know, achieving results. And quite frankly, where I am in my career and in my life, focused on outcomes and on having impact, and having moved my own self-aspiration in terms of my self-evolvement from one who sought the past 10 years to live a life of meaning, to meaning moving that forward to aspiring to live a life of significance.
And affinity groups. We're going to go to a polling question here in a moment. But before we do that, what does this mean to you, the affinity groups conversation?
Mm-hmm. So Jina, for me, it's beyond affinity group, right? As we know, and I'll speak for all groups, but particularly for those of us who are members of the African diaspora, and we know that that's complex. Mm-hmm. And so what I've learned to refer to us is to sort of frame the richness of the Black experience, that I refer to us as the African diaspora. I think that what groups like NABA, like Alpha, like Ascend, and NESB and others offer, when we really get to thinking about it, it's fourfold. It's the four-legged stool, so it's pretty sturdy. One, it's the idea that we provide support, right? It's the idea that we do this for each other with a great sense of we are connected, we've got network, we know what's happening, and it's sort of for NABA, the lifting as we climb, etc. The second piece is increasing competencies, right? Because sometimes we're the one who are not invited to the super duper leadership academy, or all the other things that our other counterparts might be. And so the opportunity to participate in a group like NABA and have access to programs, have access to other resources, educational support in a way that may not be available in our places of business, or maybe out of reach in terms of the expense associated with it.
Well, let me pause for a second, because now you're starting to give away the answers. Mm-hmm. So before that, what I'd like to do is let's ask our audience our first polling question, Jason, if we can, because I would love to know how familiar our attendees are with the different affinity groups in our industry.
All right, so with that, poll number 1 is live. We're going to leave the poll open for about a minute, so everybody go ahead and get your answers in as quickly as you can. The quicker you all answer, the quicker we can return to the presentation. So go ahead and vote, and don't forget to hit that submit button once you put your response in. So we've got about half the audience voting in and about 30 seconds remaining in the poll. We'll have 3 more polls after this one. Go ahead and get your answers in.
So I can see we have 90%, quite a few.
We'll leave it open just a bit longer. We want to make sure everyone has every opportunity to answer a poll for CPE. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out in 3, 2, and 1.
So I'm looking at the results, and in terms of familiarity, we have 24% said yes, but 70, okay, can I do math? 70-something%, 72% said no. And so that's why I'm like, you're giving away the answer. So in terms of affinity groups, so you said you had gone on and you gave us 2 things.
Mm-hmm. The third piece is particular true, I think, is the idea of expanded leadership development. So at NABA, a lot of our volunteer leaders have a chance to experience managing a P&L, leading others through influence, because we all know that when you're leading volunteers, it's an influence exercise that may not be offered. They don't have the opportunity to do. And then the last piece that I think is super, super important is the idea of relatedness. I mean, we all talk about in the field of diversity and equity about the criticality of representation. Mm-hmm. And, I think sometimes we stop there, right? We say representation matters. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes as somebody who's seeking significance, I focus on the why. I answer the why question often, or I seek to answer the why question often. And when we say it matters and we say why, it's the ability to see myself in something, which is called the relatedness. I can project myself in it. I can see myself in it. And we know that that as again, the field is evolving, and I'm starting to see more and more people talking about DEIB, which is the idea of belonging. There can be no belonging without a sense of relatedness. in my opinion. Here comes my activism and my opinions, starting to show up, right? I don't think we can achieve belonging without relatedness. And I think that this is where the great opportunity of what I call the diamond, which are the AIG, academia, industry, and government, can really begin to embrace and celebrate and figure out that groups like NABA, NSB, et cetera, are not affinity groups that are nice to have.
Yes.
They rather should be critical partners that can be at the table helping to solve some really, really important problems if we are going to move the needle on diversity. I'll say one more thing, Jina, and I'll turn it over to you for the next question. It is no surprise to me, and I know it's probably no surprise to you, that McKinsey just did, I think it was over the summer, did a report that there's an insane amount of money to the tune of almost $2 billion that has been, spent at the service of DEI, and we've not moved the needle.
Right.
And in fact, particularly true for you and I, is that Black women have continued to slide, even though we're the one achieving, degrees at higher rate, forming businesses at higher rate. When it looks at the result of corporate America, we've slid, right? And so this idea of groups like NABA, NSB, Black MBA, et cetera, to create the space and places of relatedness, right. I think it's really, really important.
So, it's interesting you say that. And for our audience, McKinsey has been putting out reports now for quite some time on diversity and inclusion. And to your point, I think one of the first one come out, it was 2015, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time I think people started to take notice of mm-hmm. the connection in terms of the business purpose. We're not doing this because it's the right thing to do. We're not doing this because we want people to feel good. Yes, those are important. But there's actually a business purpose here. And now the data
35% better, improved performance. When you look at businesses that are well diverse, yep. they outperform their peers by at least 35%. That is significant.
It not only that, but it's bottom line performance. Mm-hmm. It's actually measurable increases in innovation. Mm-hmm. It's lower turnover costs and mm-hmm. higher employee engagement, employee business decision making. I mean, it's the impacts are there. And like yes. to your point, we're not necessarily moving the needle. And so that's organizations right. are spending all of this money on diversity and inclusion, but not necessarily looking at affinity groups as part of that spend. Mm-hmm. So I know we were talking earlier, and you've mentioned this before. Mm-hmm. How can organizations, so fine, NABA's great. I'll join NABA. Mm-hmm. But is that the only purpose? How can my firm, my company, for those listening, also join NABA? What can corporations and accounting firms, government agencies, how can they partner with or work with affinity groups? And by the way, you mentioned quite a few, just so our attendees see it right here. Oops, sorry. I grabbed some logos. You mentioned a few here, like the Black MBA Association. Mm-hmm. There's a Black Fill in the Blank Association. There's a Latino mm-hmm. Fill in the Blank Association. Mm-hmm. So Guylaine is the CEO of NABA. But our conversation here is important to understand broadly. All of these groups can serve corporate America. All right, mm-hmm. so that was my long question. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think that there are several ways in which organizations should engage. Part of it is our fault, right, as affinity group leaders in how we've engaged with industry. I'm big on, the accountability department. And part of it is what I hope this conversation will lead to, which is a shift on how we're seen. We're not a nice to have, right? Historically, though, I think most of these organizations, associations, have engaged in industry to say, come to our convention, come to our conference, come to our what it is that we do, participate, and oh, by the way, you're going to have access to a wide pool of talent that you can come in and meet people and have access to talent, right? As somebody, I was just teasing with Jason that I do need my, presenter CPE because I have 2 licenses that I got to feed and one of them is the SHRM SCP, we know that this is not even, and it's funny because we've positioned this as in the talent space as recruiting. It's not recruiting, it's sourcing. All we've done is say, we've got people coming, we've got a job fair, just come and meet people, come hang out with us, and then you'll meet people, which is really the business of sourcing.
Which is but one piece of D&I, but yes.
Very little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we've got to be is intentional in having the opportunity in positioning ourselves and engaging with industry in business as a key strategist in solving this D&IB challenges, because we understand them, we know them, and pivot what we do from a sourcing, a conference, to really saying, what are the, what is it that the business is trying to solve? And quite frankly, beyond DEI to the ESG. Because when you really think about where DEI lives on the ESG platform. And we know that corporate boards, we know that businesses have to be focused on ESG. What does that mean? And how might we become part of, because the other thing that when you talk about Affinity Group, Gina, that I'm absolutely fascinated, everybody has employee resource group, right? But those employee resource group are very under-resourced. Is that a space where NABA, National Society of Black Certified
Public
Accountant, yeah, could come in and it can come in and really serve as with DID again of having expertise, having solutions, being able to lay down strategies, and industry has to be willing to fund that as well. Because if we're talking about DEI, we got to, you can't separate one portion of it and not the other. What we know for sure is that Black women like you and I, or people of the African diaspora, have a harder time securing funds for their organizations than our counterpart. So there's got to be that understanding. We've got to have the funding, we've got to have the access, and we've got to have the opportunity to do good work.
So if I go back to one of your opening points in that conversation and paraphrase, what I'm hearing you say is that if I work at Acme Company, I'm working on my diversity strategy, I should see NABA, I should see Alpha, I should see Inroads or the NSBCPA, or I have other Ascend. I should see these organizations as thought leaders that I can work with in developing my strategy and understanding the different constituents that I'm serving, and
co-develop the programs, the solutions to help move the needle.
And I think so often, and for far too long, affinity groups have been something we go join to be a part of. And so I think that's really important. And one of the ways I would position that is it's the business equivalent of lived experience. That's one of the things we talk about, that you can't have men trying to come up with diversity strategies for women. You need the women to be part of that conversation, because the women, they can bring to you their experiences and understand those barriers and share ideas for getting over those barriers or dismantling those barriers.
We know that in organizational development, that it works to the extent that the people you're trying to serve are part of the solution.
Yes.
The model, which is an archaic model of a group of people sitting in a room designing a strategy and then implementing it in a business unit in all over the world, in a different country, whatever you want to call it, does not work, period. I think we can all agree now. Now, some people will continue to permeate, like I always say, the classic definition of insanity. But what we know for sure is that research has proven it doesn't work, right? We gotta be able to talk about the savior complex that is behind all of this, or the belief that maybe we can't solve for ourselves and that we don't have ideas, which sort of started with my comment about being an agitator and a disruptor, right? Because those are the conversations we have to be able to have. There's a lot that's being written about psychological safety, right? But if historically I've not felt safe at Acme Company,
Right.
just because somebody said, oh, we're psychological safe, please give us feedback.
Yes.
The idea that we're going to be foolish enough
It
to
doesn't
come and
work.
tell you what's really happening
Yes.
is not okay. And some of those policies, I think, may have been, I'm big on giving people credit and grace because I need to be the recipient of such, good intention, and grace and on a minute by minute basis. But, even large companies that I'm sure you, Jina, have heard recently and some of the audience about some of those policies around sexual harassment, for example, where, it forces people to go to mediation first before anything else happens. That's not a good policy. That does not create psychological safety. So those are all the ways in which we have to peel the onion, have to have real conversation, agree and understand that ERG groups are not going to do that because of the consequences or perceived consequences for them. And that, groups, organization, I don't even want us referred as groups because we're not.
Right.
We're bona fide organizations, national organizations that have a view and a reach across the country, that have purview on what multiple businesses and in the field, they're all kinds of vertical in the fields also, that we've got a purview and understanding that we lean in and we listen, that can become to be cross-pollinated in terms of best practices. And so I've never understood why we're not at the table as part of the strategy. And I equate that in what my hope and my aspirations in having these conversations with you and the subsequent conversations that, I'm having in other places and spaces. And if I don't offend anybody, hopefully I'm invited back, to continue a part two, is this idea that I equate this to back in the days when people saw HR as sort of like, yeah, HR, it was, did payroll, did these things, and sort of was not at the table. And I think that SHRM, for example, has done an extraordinary good job of elevating the field of human resources as a key strategic partner in the people side of the business equation. And what I'm hopeful for is that through conversations like this one, through collaborations that we develop amongst our organizations,
we have this
that we are beginning to move the needle to create a seat at the table. And, this idea that the tide will rise all boats, right? And so that's my view around that.
So I want to pause and we'll do another polling question. This question, sorry, I have something in my eye. This question is, are you a member of an affinity group organization? So let's do that one. Jason.
All right, that second poll should be available for everyone to answer. Go ahead and get your responses into poll number 2. And leave it open for about a minute, so go ahead and get your answers in. Again, this is poll question number 2, so go ahead and vote on this poll. We'll have 2 more polls following this one, and we'll leave this open for about 30 more seconds.
So while you have that open, there was a question that came in about what do you mean by move the needle? And so, Marcia, I just wanted to address that. We're referring to the demographics in terms of, let's say, percentage of Black CPAs. And are we noticing a change where we're seeing progress? And so if we're noticing progress, then we are, quote unquote, moving the needle. That's one example, but that's what we're referring to.
Right, Jina, and may I add, when you look at the percentage of Black partners or Black VPs, or, the C-suite, right? I mean, a lot of people, there's been much written about, the number of Black, the number in very low numbers of Black CEOs of Fortune 1000 companies, right? And so for me, I've also directed people to go look at the numbers of Black people at the CFO level of companies, because that talks about that for me equates with this whole idea of economic mobility, economic justice, economic wherewithal. And so, and it's amazing that, in that key role, which is controls the wallet, the financial resources, there's very, very, very low Black representation.
And, you know, it's interesting. So this isn't intended to be a dialogue about race, but you are the CEO of NABA, which stands for the National Association of Black Accountants. For those who don't know, you now go by NABA, but for those who aren't familiar. And then there are other organizations. I'm the chair of the National Society of Black CPAs. There are other organizations here. Let me put them on the screen. Somebody asked about them. Ascend represents all of the Pan-Asian community. Alpha, there's an F in there, ALPFA, that's the Association of Latin Professionals for America. So that's Latino, Latina, Latinx. And then we have the National LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce is here just to show that there's this wide variety of organizations. And I realized in this conversation, I didn't even think to put, my bad, associations that support women, because gender is another area of diversity. Every area that's a dimension of diversity, these are the types of groups that we're talking about. These are the groups that bring that subject matter expertise that you were talking about. Now, you had provided us a couple of slides, and I want to go backwards to this slide because I want you to talk about this because I don't know that people think of it in terms of a pathway, that they go as far back as this chart goes all the way to preschool. Why is it so long? Can you talk about that?
So we know at NABA that we're about empowering Black business leaders at every step of the journey. That's the forward view for NABA. And we know that as an organization, we are not gonna, we're not at the bandwidth right now where we're gonna be in the preschool and middle school business. However, it matters because when you think about the percentage of Black women who are in roles that could feed the pipeline, back office support, payroll, you name it, one of the barriers, well-documented barriers of entry for progression is access to good preschool, support in elementary school, right? We all know about the prison to pipeline at the 5th grade level. This is a real thing.
Yes, it is.
And then, sort of like, how do you move people to have the solid foundation of STEM to be able to move to high school? So for us, if you look at where the dotted line begins, it is clear that we're going to focus our programs, our expertise from high school on up. However, in conversations and developing what is now what you're seeing, which is a theory of change, we had to name these issues because they will be core of how we partner with other organizations to address it for a particular part of our constituent. But ultimately, Jina, as you've just called it, we call it Pathways to Black Business Leadership. We're in the process of trademarking it because we've spent a lot of time and resources in formatting it, and we continue to be encouraged and filled, right, by the resonance that it's finding in a lot of places. But it's the idea of also to start to think about the way in which organizations such as yours and mine can give wording that are more respectful, create a space of belonging. And one we're particular after is this idea of traditional pathways. What does that mean?
Right.
Because the minute you say a traditional pathway, which is the idea of high school to the 4-year degree, which I don't like either, into the workforce, right? We're then assuming that everybody who does something different is on a non-traditional pathway. And I don't know anybody in here. We've got 180 people listening, plus us that'll say, I want to be non-traditional, and everybody raises their hands, right? That doesn't exist.
Not anymore.
Right? So we need to have words that talk about that people will enter, right, the field of business, which includes finance and accounting and technology, because we can't separate business and technology, right? We know that AI is going to disrupt the world of accounting the way we knew it. Right? And so, well, listen, I'm trying to be gentle. I'm trying not to show too much of my disruptor's chops here, okay? So, but you know what is disrupting, right? The world of accounting and finance the way we knew it used to be, right? And so the idea is to recognize and say that different people can enter this pathway to Black business leadership at any point,
Yes.
and that we ought to be able to support and engage and so on, right back to this support, competency, autonomy, which has to do with this idea of agency. I can choose how I lead my career, right? And this idea of relatedness,
Yes.
so that people can achieve their whole potential. We want to talk about where the pipeline is. Every business I talk to, in every group I talk to, right, and associations like ours, talk about like the pipeline is concerning,
Yes.
right? And
Across
it's
all dimensions of diversity, I might add.
all, but let me just point out though, because I am very clear, we are very clear at NABA and unapologetic that we're going to focus on folks who are part of the African diaspora. And that is the one that is at the lowest. Retention in the field of accounting in schools is below 6% for Black folks.
Now, I want to reinforce that point, and in a different way. I think it's critically important that you make no apologies for doing that. And the reason I say that is that it's going to take concerted effort, intentionality. Now, 2 weeks ago, I had Alfonso on, and the whole topic was
wonderful, man. I love Alfonso Alexander at NASBA, right? And the Center for Public Trust.
And his topic was intentionality. And for those listening, these are all available on demand. I think you don't get CPE, but you can watch them again. And so that intentionality word is there. Each affinity group has to be unapologetic, serving their audience, their constituents, their group, because it is the collective. One of the things we know for sure is when you open the door to that diaspora and you look at the people in there, it's not monolithic. Within the Black community, there is tremendous diversity. And so what these organizations do is you take all of that collective knowledge, experience, background, understanding, awareness, and that's the very same expertise that you were referring to before that organizations can leverage in developing the strategy as a partner. And so I just want to emphasize, because there's a possibility that somebody...
important, right? Let me just do a triple click if I can, because I love this conversation with you, right? You and I have talked about how my journey as a Black woman in America, but that grew up in the Caribbean, is very different. There are nuances for my daughters who grew up in America.
Or there are nuances for my sons who grew up at a different, with a completely different perspective and understanding of what it means to be Black in the United States. And again, we're focusing on race. And I just want to reinforce this with our audience, because sometimes we'll get comments, well, this was just about race, or this was just about women. We're using this as an example. But when you talk about any of these groups, there is a broad conversation about diversity overall. But in order to move the needle for any one group or across the board broadly become more diverse, we need to also address the challenges, the issues, concerns, and the barriers for each individual group. You can't fix something for one group and think, well, we've done it for one, it should happen for all. Sometimes that works. You said it earlier, the tide lifts all boats. But sometimes some boats need to be patched.
The issues are different.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's why I want to say this is not about race. This is about diversity. And if we're going to get serious about it, we cannot talk about diversity. It would be for me the same thing as when people talk about art. Music is art. Painting is art. Writing poetry is art. But each one of those art forms takes a different training, a different variation, and it takes a different expression of the soul.
Totally stealing that. I love that.
Good, please do, because this is what this is about, is the commonality of language that we develop by having these conversations.
Yes.
So if we're going to continue to say, I mean, I'm seeing organizations that have very, very few Black people, very low Black representation, very low minimist, like you could count it on one hand, Black partners, report data that says we're 31% diverse. because we've got white women, because we've got, you know, but you know, you're not diverse, right? And so these are the things that, you know what, at NABA, under my leadership, with my trait of being an activist and a disruptor and all the stuff that you wanted me to say at the beginning, is that we need to talk about these things, because that's why Black people continue to be alienated, and why I talked about a little bit that when you look at Black women, we continue to be pushed down. This is not my word, right? There is data that proves that part of the challenge is you've got millennials and Gen Zs who are proud of their natural curly hair, right? And all that comes with the colors we wear and the way we speak and the way we engage, that makes it so that make others deeply uncomfortable. I mean, like, there's all kinds of research about it.
Right.
But if we want to talk about this idea of diversity as a broad topic, and we're not willing to double click into the nuances, into what that means,
What each group
and all the way though of intersectionality,
Yes.
right? I have said that at NABA, eventually as we transform, we need to talk about the experience of Black people who are, you know, on the LGBTQA, who also are Black and participate, you know, are also identified, you know, in the gender diversity space, because that is a unique perspective as well. Right, we're finding more and more that sometimes people identify as two races.
Oh, of course.
In my own island of Hispaniola, right? Black people, you know, you've got the Black Haitians, which I'm one of them, but they're Black Dominican and they identify as Afro-Latin, right? And so that's another nuance. And, you know, I know that you are Black and Asian. That's a nuance, right? So there is certainly a place of intersectionality that we cannot ignore. And I'm going to continue to say, we cannot look at this DEI under a broad lens if we're not willing to double click and triple click and look at all that is underneath it. And the African diaspora experience in this country is not showing
Right.
that we are making progress in creating an inclusive world. And in our words at NABA, a more just world.
So I couldn't agree more with everything you just said, of course. And just now what popped into my head, you said there are people who identify as more than one race. And I raised my hand because I'm half Filipino and I'm half Black. And I've always struggled with that question on the census. It's changed. But many of those demographic questions used to make you pick just one. And so that's a small indication of the types of changes that it's decades in the making. You know, the passport, I believe it was last year, the passport now came out with an X for gender. So you can say male, female, or X. Now that X, it's whatever it means to you.
Right.
But that's important to recognize that we're starting to see these little baby changes. But to your point, diversity is a very broad topic. And we're still at the top level. And we have opportunity.
And you know, Gina, let me just say again, allow me to respectfully double click on what you say. You'll hear me say double click a lot, right? When we say small changes, again, I will frame this to say this is huge, right? Because as a study of Stephen Covey and the word he brought into a lot of our business minds, which is the idea of paradigm, once the paradigm shift even a millimeters or nanometers, nothing else is the same.
Absolutely.
And that's why I know for a fact that dare speak for you. That's why you and I, we do the work that we do.
Absolutely.
That's what that's our why.
That's
right. Because
that's also
this conversation. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say that's also the way this changes.
Correct.
Because we're not going to. I don't know if I've said this before on this program. We're not going to boil the ocean. It doesn't work that way.
Well, we can attempt to. I mean, we certainly can attempt.
We can stir things up a little bit at a time, and so that's what we're trying to do. I wanted to come back to this opening slide because I want to make sure you touch on something. I thought this was so powerful when we spoke about how affinity groups provide this, what you have here, career continuity. So can you talk, hold on, what time is it? want to see if
We
I'm
have
going to get in trouble
3:39.
for a
We're good.
polling question.
I think maybe we just ask the question and then I won't answer it. We'll do the third poll and then I'll answer it after the third poll.
You just want time to think about it, but okay.
No.
The
You
question,
know I'm ready.
I know you got this. The question I want you to help our audience understand is what that means and why it's so important. Because in theory, you can get this anywhere, but there's something different and unique and special when you can do it in community. So Jason, we're going to go ahead and flip to that third polling question, and we'll let our audience respond to that before we move on.
All right, that third poll is up. The question is, has your organization partnered with affinity groups or organizations? Go ahead and get your answers in. This is poll number 3, and we will leave this open for about a minute. We will have one more poll in our remaining time after this one, so everyone, please go ahead and get your answers in to poll number 3. We'll leave this open for about another 30 seconds. Big thanks to everybody who's already gotten their answers in so far.
I don't know, you saw me, I had to turn around and pull away from my camera briefly. Everyone may have noticed that. It was my dog is snoring, and it was getting kind of loud. And I didn't
He's
want
having sweet dreams.
He was, so I had to sort of like wake him up and nudge him a little bit because I didn't want it to get louder during our session.
That's delightful.
That's just called working from home these days. So.
We couldn't hear, but I hope your dog is having a great nap. And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out of the poll in 3, 2, and 1.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the results, and I see 27% said no, 45% said not sure. And I think there's an invitation there for the 45%. Those who said no, I mean, there might be some really clear reasons, or it just might not be on the what's the word I'm looking for? It might not be on the plans in the short term. But for those who said they're not sure, I think this is an opportunity to say, let me go back and find out a little bit more and better understand how what we're talking about today could actually parallel, support, and reinforce what they're doing in their organization. All right, now back to the question of career continuity. What is it, and why is it something that I can get at a NABA that I just can't get, anywhere else?
So a couple of things, Gina. When we talk about career continuity, I want to talk about the right-brainers that tend to be very linear, right? I do accountant 1, accountant 2, and so off it goes. And what Gen X and millennials are proving in the needs of industry and the disruption of technology is that model will not work. In a lot of places and spaces, people are talking about the idea of transportable, more than transferable, transportable skills, right? The idea of transportable skills and the opportunity for them to be articulated to advance one career. I gave an example. Some of our chapter leaders have an opportunity to manage P&L, which we know is so important to get into the C-suite. It is not necessarily offered to them in their current role, the one that pays the bill. But the ability to just have managed a P&L, to have had conversation, which is why we're transforming NABA, to engage our chapter leaders, to have conversation, org-wide planning, org-wide conversation and discussion on an intentional way. They're learning governance. They're learning, strategy and how to execute and implement a strategy. Those are portable skills that we're finding actually accelerate careers. And it is done in a place, again, that we've talked about, where there is relatedness. There are other chapter leaders that are in the same career space that they are, right? There's the idea of the competency development. And there's the idea of the agency to make decisions that would not be afforded them, right, in the place of work. That's the first piece. The second piece is really, quite frankly, is again, what happens in groups like your, organizations like yours and mine who are deeply committed to career advancement, that's why our pathway is so laid out, is also because I believe fundamentally that it gives people the opportunity to engage with their mentors, their advisors, other folks. I mean, I talk to people all the time to say, you can be an auditor, go take that class and get the CISA certification, and you can move into cyber, right? And we're seeing, quite frankly, we had data analysis performed for us at NABA that proved that 76%, which is why we kept the name NABA, right? Condensed it because of the equity that's contained in it, but that we've expanded to empowering Black business leaders at every point of the journey to cast that wider net. Because what we found is that 76% of our membership may have has the degree in accounting or finance and whatever, but they've pivoted to HR, D&I, and that's the beauty of an accounting degree, is that the accounting degree gives you the language of business, but it doesn't mean that you have to stay in that box. And I think that those are two ways that, organizations, I'm going to continue to push you gently now. We're not groups, we're organization bona fide.
Oh, no,
They don't have impact in this country.
I agree. And affinity groups as a term is the term that other people are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think understanding what those terms mean is a critical component of understanding diversity and inclusion. You talked about LGBTQIA. There are so many variations of that acronym.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that there are variations in the acronym can confuse people. And it's really about understanding more deeply what's behind that.
Yes, I agree.
But I wanted to also touch on this, and maybe I'm just paraphrasing what you said. But one of the most powerful things, or not most, let me rephrase. One of the powerful things about career continuity is if I'm a member of NABA as a student, I'm a member of NABA as I become a CPA. I'm a member of NABA as I move up to the C-suite.
Mm-hmm.
That pathway you were showing earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that happens is if I've changed jobs over the course of that career, at any given job, I'm going to have maybe a mentor, a sponsor, a champion, an advocate. But if Bob's my advocate at
hopefully,
but this is just the model. Let's say I'm at Acme Company and Bob is in fact acting as a mentor and a champion and a sponsor for me. When I leave Acme, I lose that sponsorship. I might retain that mentorship, but I lose that sponsorship. And now I go to ABC Company. I'm starting all over again. And while that's part of the journey, that is part of the growth and development of any professional. So you have to learn how to do those, make those changes, build those relationships. But if I'm also looking at a parallel journey within NABA, within NSBCPA, within Inroads, within Alpha, within Ascend, I have the continuity of the mentorship, as well as the peer sort of cohort. All of us that passed the CPA exam back in the day, I was just talking to somebody earlier about how, well, I had to sit in a folding chair and take a pencil at a table in the gym for 3.5 days to pass the CPA exam, right? So all of us feel like we have some badge.
Mm-hmm.
But so we're a group, because that's not true for everybody who passed the CPA exam. So there's this commonality then for the people that I've moved through my career with, but I can only share that at an organization that's an affinity group. And I can be part of multiple,
and
by the way.
That's part of the relatedness too, right, Gina? That's why all the legs, the 4 legs start to entwine themselves, right? Because it's part of that relatedness.
Right.
It's part of I have somebody that's going to celebrate me when I've passed part 1. It's part of the folks that are going to say, pick up your head, you get to cry in your popcorn today, but tomorrow we're back, we're back at it. You were not the only one. It's all of these. And I will also add, Jenna, to that excellent point you just made, that on an average week, I get 10 to 15 requests for connection to great talent on average.
Yes.
10 to 15. And the opportunity, I mean, the opportunity for me to point people to say, hey, have you talked to Jina? Have you talked to, like, who are the people, right? And for me, that was a testimony of what NABA stands for. People, the phone is ringing, the email is coming through because people recognize that we are a place where we can informally connect people.
Right. That's also,
right, with great talent.
That's absolutely the power. You've been talking about employee resource groups. Employee resource groups are another way for organizations to think about connecting to affinity groups, affinity organizations. We'll change the title.
Thank you for that, ma'am.
Don't call me ma'am. I'm not that old. But anyway.
I was just trying to channel my inner Southern self.
The important thing here is, and I'm starting to slice the pie, like I have parallels and I have verticals and then I have horizontals. And the point here is that everything connects to everything. So you have an employee resource group, an African-American employee resource group, whatever you're going to call it. Members of that group can benefit from all of the different values that an affinity group can bring. They bring that to the firm or to the organization through the lens of the employee resource group. The organization can partner with the affinity organization. The firm or the company can partner with the organization on an organizational wide level to build strategy, to build awareness. In particular, one of the things in my work is trying to get the leadership to do the training, because usually leadership, they're very, very smart. They're the ones that have become aware that this is important. They might be the ones that are hiring the diversity staff. They are providing training and resources to their employees. Therefore, they get it. They don't need the training. But it's important for them to be able to understand their role and the level, the role that they play and what they're responsible for. And I think this is another area where affinity organizations can help and support firms and companies and governments, because it's a peer-to-peer conversation at this point. Leadership. That's exactly right. To leadership.
That's so right.
There's so many different perspectives to have around organizations like this. It goes way beyond membership. Now, I'll just go ahead and say this though. Organizations, companies, firms can also pay for memberships for their employees, because their employees are benefiting from this too, rather than it's an out-of-pocket expense. So, by the way, I'm looking at the time. I know you have a hard stop. And before we wrap up, I have to also get a fourth polling question there. So let's do the fourth polling question, and then we can come back and wrap up so that you're not late for your next.
Thank you, Jina.
Sure.
All right, so poll number 4 is currently live. Everyone go ahead and get your answers in as quickly as you are able. We'll close out of this poll shortly and then turn it back to Jina and Guylaine for a quick wrap up. And of course, we thank you all for your participation in this poll and for your participation in today's webinar. So glad to see how many people learned something new in today's session. We'll leave this poll open for about 30 more seconds while you all get your votes in. So go ahead and vote on the fourth and final poll. All right, we've got just about the majority of the audience in. Thank you again so much for your votes on this poll. We're going to go ahead and close out in 3, 2, and 1.
Can I say what I love about the attendees and the participants on this polling question in particular is the honesty. 26%. What was the best value you got today? CPE. Hey, look, we are accountants, CPAs, and other professionals who need CPE, so that's all good. But the 52% that said learn something new, I'm excited to hear that. So thank you for sharing those stories. Do you have any last comments that you want to share before we wrap up?
I want to thank you for having me as your guest. I want to thank you for creating a space where we have really good dialogue, rich dialogue. I want to thank Jason for all the great work he's done to make sure that everything worked and functioned so that we could engage with this audience. I want to thank the 180 so people who have lent us their time, their ears, even if it's for CPE. I know we should still continue, we'll learn something anyway, if not even being reminded. And I just want to encourage everybody to lean into the understanding. NABA is not here to, we speak the truth. And we speak the truth at the service of saying, if we don't tell the truth, we will find ourselves 95 years from now with having made no progress.
We'll be having the same.
If we want to make progress, we're going to continue to have the same conversation. It is my hope, my aspiration, my why, that by having those kinds of dialogue, that, you know what, we start to path and pave a more just world. So thank you for having me, Jina.
Sure, and everyone listening to those comments knows exactly why I wanted you to be here. Thoughtful, strategic, visionary, and I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you so much.
I just want to remind everyone that Guylaine's contact information, if you download the slides, let me jump to that slide right quick. If you download the PowerPoint slides, which you can do here, on her contact information at the bottom, you see some icons here. You can click on those if you want to jump out to the website, visit her LinkedIn profile, etc. Same is true for me. You can reach me online. And I've encouraged people to watch the on-demand replays. One in particular, last summer, I don't know if you heard about this one, but Dr. Adrian Mays was with us. He wrote the book, When I Grow Up, I Want to Be an Accountant. And I just thought of it because of the pathway that you were talking about that starts in preschool. These conversations are so critical. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. And Jason, I will turn it back over to you to wrap us up.
Jina,
Friday, everybody.
Thank you both so much for your insight and for having this conversation with us here at CPA Academy. And thanks to all of you in the audience for your participation and attendance. CPE will be issued by the end of the day today, and it will be available in your accounts within 24 hours. Thank you all again for your participation and your attendance. We hope to see you all on future webinars, and have a great rest of the day.